Okay, so we are continuing now with cell division. We talked yesterday mainly about, for example, chromosomes and chromatin and their role in cell division. So remember, chromatin is DNA and protein that are found as thread-like structures inside in the nucleus, and they are basically chromosomes because chromosomes are then the condensed form of that just before we have cell division. So, what will we be looking at today? We'll be looking at the main life cycle, the main part of the life cycle of a cell, which is what we call interphase. Interphase is a time of a cell's life where it spends about 90% of its time doing the following. So, what I want you to picture is a cell that has just been produced as a result of cell division. It is a young, immature cell. Let's picture, for example, a young, immature cheek cell. So a new cell has been made, and for all intensive purposes, it is um, a a baby. Okay, so this baby cell needs to grow. It needs to get bigger, and that is what it's going to be spending a lot of its time doing. It's going to be making itself bigger. And how do you make yourself bigger? Well, you need things like, for example, protein. So, what is happening here in this 90% of this cell cycle of its life? Well, it is producing something called protein. Protein is being produced at the ribosomes of the cell, and those ribosomes are producing lots of protein to help build this cell up. So, protein is needed for lots of different things, like, for example, the cell membrane. It's going to need to reinforce that cell membrane as it gets bigger. We also have to think about, for example, when the cell division happened, a lot of the organelles were split between the two cells. So you have a lot less organelles at the very infancy of this cell's life. So it's going to have to replicate these cell organelles. So what organelles are we talking about? We're talking about the ribosomes, as I just mentioned. We need to make sure we have lots more ribosomes. We need to make sure that we have also got lots of mitochondria. Okay, remember the ribosomes are there for making protein. We need mitochondria for making energy. We need lots of other things as well. So, if this was a plant cell, for example, a plant cell would need to replicate its chloroplasts. Remember, the chloroplasts are there for photosynthesis. Okay, let's just try to think now. Is there anything else that we need to have replicated? Well, they are the main things anyway. Okay, so we have a period of growth that's happening for the cell. We have a period of reproduction of organelles. We also have the different cell kind of processes that happen in cells normally during this process of interphase. Okay, so we have, for example, a normal animal cell, like our cheek cell, for example, is undergoing respiration. So all cells need energy. So that means you have to break down carbohydrates and produce energy. So respiration is happening in all cells. What else is happening? Photosynthesis. So if it's a plant cell, they're undergoing photosynthesis. And the final thing, and this is probably the most important thing here for the purposes of cell division, and that is DNA replication. So, what's actually happening here is that the chromosome number is actually, the chromosomes themselves are doubling in shape. So we start off with chromatin and we end up producing these familiar chromosome structures as a result here of interphase. So that process here is really happening here just before um, cell division takes place. Right, so we looked at this definition briefly yesterday, but just to highlight again what this means, it means that you start with one cell and you finish up with two cells. So cell continuity is the way cells exist from generation to generation, or you can phrase it whatever way you want, as long as you've got your keywords. You could also say they exist from pre-existing cells. Right. So the key thing here, guys, and what often comes up here in terms of the stages of the life cycle of a cell. Students often seem to think that cells spend all of their time dividing and producing new cells. And while they do spend a good chunk of their life doing that, it's not what happens all the time. Okay? Cells, in fact, spend most of their time in what we call interphase. Okay? Inter means between, and phase, so in between phases. Spend 90% of the time. I mean, if you think about that, that's a huge chunk of the life cycle. Only 10%, however, of the time is spent in cell division. You need to know those percentages, by the way. Okay, you need to learn those percentages off. 90% interphase, 10% is spent uh, on cell division. Interphase used to be called the resting stage of the cell's life, but that obviously is not true. As we just mentioned in the previous slide, cells are working very hard because they have to grow in size, they have to produce new organelles, they have to replicate their DNA, they have to undergo respiration for energy, photosynthesis to make their own food. So they're very busy doing stuff. So they're not resting whatsoever. Okay. So all of these points here are mentioned about what the cells are actually doing. And this is all happening here in interphase. Now, the thing here, guys, as well is when you're asked here about interphase, you should have at least 2 or 3 points here. So you'll have to learn off 2 or 3 of these. Right, so let's go back now and let's have a quick look here. And I think, yeah, oh, there's one more slide actually, in fact, before we go and have a look at your notes. Right, so I looked at this kind of diagram here yesterday, and that was what wool, I suppose, how we can picture wool and how it will help us understand chromatin and chromosomes. So if you were to look at this picture, just think for a second, is that the chromatin or is it the chromosome? So this single threads here would represent the disorganized chromatin, and the wool, the balls of wool themselves would be the chromosome because they're highly organized structures. What we need to know here is what will happen by the end of interphase in order to be able to draw this out. Okay, so what we would know here is that the chromatin, the single stranded chromatin, has replicated and has replicated into what we call double stranded chromosomes. Okay, so like this. So that chromatin is no longer in the form of chromatin, it is starting to change into double stranded chromosomes. These chromosomes, as we said, are visible underneath a light microscope. Okay, so you can see the chromosomes underneath the light microscope. You can also see the nucleolus, which is a part of the nucleus that stains darkly underneath the microscope, and you can see the nuclear membrane. But the key thing that you would recognize is that it appears to be breaking apart underneath the microscope. Once all of these conditions are met, once it's reached a stage in its life cycle where the double stranded chromosomes have been produced, where the nuclear membrane is breaking down, well, we say that that is ready now for cell division. Okay, and this will be what we will be looking at next in terms of the I suppose cell division, and we're going to be drawing that all out tomorrow together. Right, so let's go back over the notes now a second and see where we stopped up. So your job for me for today was to draw out the first 3 slides of notes, and what we want to look at now is this slide here on the notes and see does it make sense for us. So what we want to say here in terms of what a cell is doing during interphase, have I mentioned all of those points? The organelles are replicating, protein synthesis is happening, so allowing the cell to grow. It is respiring, producing energy. Now, these letters ATP probably makes no sense to you right now, but it will when we do respiration. Photosynthesis is happening in plant cells only. And we know that by the end of interphase, the DNA has replicated, the single-stranded chromatin has become double-stranded chromosomes. Right, exam question. What molecules are made during interphase? This one came up a few years ago. And molecules, remember, a molecule is just it's kind of like a compound. So basically, what kind of compounds have been made? Well, there's DNA itself. Okay, that DNA was replicated. Remember, protein synthesis happened, and also if you're talking about a plant cell, you could talk about making carbohydrates or maybe fats. So those would all be answers to that previous question. And it only asked in this particular question for two different molecules that came up a few years ago. Right, so that's enough for today. And your job will be to write up just one more slide of notes, and we will continue tomorrow.